Dog stares down empty road, refusing food. When he moves, the truth breaks hearts. It was a desolate stretch of road that seemed to go on forever, cutting through fields of tall grass and wildflowers. The road was quiet, with only the occasional hum of a passing car breaking the silence. For most people, it was just another forgotten back road in the countryside. But for one dog, it was everything. The dog appeared one day, seemingly out of nowhere. He was medium-sized, his fur a patchwork of golden brown and white, dirty and matted from weeks, perhaps months, of neglect. He had no collar, no tags, and no sign of a home. Yet every morning, just as the sun began to rise, he would take his place at the side of the road, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The first people to notice him were local farmers who traveled the road daily to tend to their fields. They were puzzled by the dog's behavior. He wasn't wandering or scavenging like most strays. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his body tense with anticipation as though waiting for something, or someone. One farmer, a kind-hearted man named Samuel, stopped his truck one morning and approached the dog. He carried a sandwich from his lunchbox, kneeling a few feet away as he held it out. "Hey there, boy," Samuel said softly. "Are you hungry?" The dog turned his head briefly, his dark, soulful eyes meeting Samuel's, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned back to the road, his gaze unwavering. Samuel sighed, placing the sandwich on the ground before retreating to his truck. From his rearview mirror, he watched as the dog remained frozen, ignoring the food entirely. Word of the dog began to spread through the small community. People speculated about where he had come from and why he refused to leave. Some thought he was waiting for an owner who had abandoned him, while others believed he had been left behind after a car accident. But no one could say for certain. Despite their growing concern, the dog resisted every attempt to help him. Neighbors left food and water by the roadside, but he wouldn't touch it. Animal control officers tried to approach him, but he would dart into the tall grass and return only when the road was quiet again. For weeks he stayed there through rain and wind, his body growing thinner but his resolve unshaken. His presence became a haunting symbol of loyalty, a silent vigil that tugged at the hearts of everyone who saw him. Among those captivated by the dog's story was a young woman named Emily, who lived in a nearby town. She had heard about him from a friend and decided to see him for herself. When she arrived at the road one afternoon, her breath caught in her throat. There he was, sitting just as the stories described, his silhouette framed by the golden light of the setting sun. Emily parked her car and approached slowly, her voice gentle. "Hi, buddy," she said, crouching a few feet away. "What are you doing out here?" The dog glanced at her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name, grief, perhaps, or hope. He didn't move, his gaze returning to the road as though her presence didn't matter. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Who are you waiting for?" she whispered. Determined to help, Emily began visiting the road daily, bringing food and water and sitting quietly nearby. She didn't try to force the dog to leave or approach him too closely. Instead, she simply kept him company, hoping her presence might ease his loneliness. As the days turned into weeks, a fragile bond began to form. The dog grew accustomed to Emily's visits, his body relaxing slightly when she was near. He still wouldn't eat the food she brought, but he allowed her to sit closer, his eyes occasionally flickering to her before returning to the road. One day, as Emily sat with him in the fading light, she decided to name him Shadow. It seemed fitting, he was always there, silent and watchful, like a shadow that refused to fade. But despite her efforts, Shadow's condition worsened. His once strong frame grew gaunt, his ribs visible beneath his matted fur. Emily knew he couldn't survive much longer without proper care, but every attempt to bring him home failed. He would bolt into the fields, returning only when the road was empty again. Frustrated and heartbroken, Emily turned to the community for help. She posted Shadow's story on social media, hoping someone might recognize him or know where he had come from. The response was overwhelming. People from across the county offered support, sharing the post and offering to help capture him. But no one had answers to the mystery of why he stayed. Then one stormy evening, everything changed. Emily was driving to the road, her headlights cutting through the torrential rain, when she spotted Shadow. He was standing this time, his body tense as he stared down the empty stretch of road. Lightning illuminated the sky, and for a brief moment, Emily thought she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition. Before she could react, Shadow took off, running down the road with a sudden burst of energy. Emily's heart raced as she followed him, her car creeping behind him as he sprinted through the rain. She had never seen him move like this before, and it filled her with a mix of hope and dread. Where was he going? And why now? Emily drove slowly, her car barely keeping pace with Shadow as he sprinted down the rain-slicked road. The storm raged around them, lightning illuminating the landscape in fleeting flashes. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Shadow, who had barely moved from his spot for weeks, was now running with a determination that seemed almost desperate. "Where are you going, boy?" she whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Suddenly, Shadow veered off the road, disappearing into the tall grass. Emily slammed on the brakes, her headlights illuminating the spot where he had vanished. Without hesitation, she grabbed her flashlight and raincoat and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked through her clothes as she waded into the grass, her flashlight beam sweeping the darkness. "Shadow," she called, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Where are you?" A faint whimper reached her ears, barely distinguishable from the storm's howling. She followed the sound, her heart racing as the beam of her flashlight finally caught Shadow's form. He was standing in a small clearing, his body trembling as he stared at something on the ground. Emily approached cautiously, her breath catching as she saw what had captured Shadow's attention. Lying in the grass was the twisted wreckage of a car, its metal frame rusted and overgrown with weeds. The vehicle had clearly been there for months, forgotten by the world but not by Shadow. "Is this it?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Is this what you've been waiting for?" Shadow let out a low, mournful whine, his body sinking to the ground. He placed his paw on the wreckage, his eyes never leaving the shattered windshield. Emily's heart broke as she knelt beside him, her flashlight revealing more details of the scene. Inside the car, covered in dirt and debris, was a small bundle of belongings, clothes, a backpack and a dog collar identical to Shadow's. The collar bore a single name, Charlie. Emily's hands shook as she pieced together the story. Shadow hadn't just been waiting for someone. He had been waiting for Charlie, his owner, who had likely been involved in the crash. The car's location explained why Shadow had stayed on the road, his loyalty anchoring him to the last place he had seen the person he loved. Tears blurred Emily's vision as she reached out to stroke Shadow's head. "Oh, Shadow," she said softly. "I'm so sorry." The dog looked up at her, his eyes filled with a grief that seemed almost human. Emily realized then that Shadow's refusal to eat, his constant vigil, and his sudden sprint down the road had all been driven by a love so strong it defied logic. As the storm began to subside, Emily knew she couldn't leave Shadow there. Gently, she wrapped a blanket around him and coaxed him toward her car. This time he didn't resist. It was as if finding the wreckage had given him some sense of closure, a final connection to the life he had lost. Back at her house, Emily dried Shadow off and prepared a warm bed for him. For the first time, he ate the food she offered, his body trembling with exhaustion as he curled up on the blanket. Emily sat beside him, her heart aching as she whispered, "You don't have to wait anymore. You're safe now." In the days that followed, Emily contacted local authorities to report the wreckage. They confirmed that the accident had occurred months earlier and that the driver had passed away at the scene. Shadow, they speculated, must have been thrown from the car during the crash and had been waiting ever since. The community, moved by Shadow's story, rallied around him. People donated supplies, offered veterinary care, and shared his tale far and wide. Shadow became a symbol of loyalty and love, his story touching hearts across the town and beyond. Shadow's story spread like wildfire. Local news stations picked it up, followed by regional outlets, and soon his tale was being shared across the country. People from all walks of life were moved by the unwavering loyalty of a dog who had waited for months, refusing to give up on the memory of his owner. Letters, messages, and donations poured in, each one carrying a piece of the world's collective grief and admiration. Emily, who had become Shadow's caretaker, was overwhelmed by the response. But through it all, her focus remained on Shadow's healing. Slowly, she helped him rebuild his strength both physically and emotionally. Though the scars of his loss remained, there were moments of progress. A wagging tail, a playful bark, or the way he leaned into Emily when she sat beside him. One morning, Emily woke to find Shadow sitting by the front door, his gaze fixed on the road outside. For a moment, her heart sank, thinking he was falling back into his old patterns. But when she opened the door, Shadow didn't bolt or linger. Instead, he walked out onto the porch and sat in the sun, his eyes calm and steady. Emily joined him, her heart full as she realized what was happening. Shadow wasn't waiting anymore, he was simply watching the world, soaking in the warmth of a new day. "You're moving forward," she said softly, stroking his fur. "And I'll be right here with you." The community, inspired by Shadow's resilience, decided to honor him and his late owner in a lasting way. With Emily's help, they created a small memorial at the site of the accident. A simple stone marker surrounded by flowers and a wooden bench. The inscription read, "In memory of Charlie and Shadow's loyalty, a testament to the power of love and devotion." On the day the memorial was unveiled, dozens of people gathered to pay their respects. Emily brought Shadow, who walked slowly toward the marker, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. He sniffed the stone, then lay down beside it, his body relaxed, his gaze peaceful. It was a moment that seemed to close the chapter on his time of waiting, allowing him to embrace the love and care that now surrounded him. As time went on, Shadow became a beloved figure in the town. Children would stop to pet him when Emily took him on walks, and neighbors often left treats and toys at her doorstep. His story inspired acts of kindness far beyond the community. Donations to animal shelters increased, and people began adopting rescue dogs in Shadow's honor, moved by his story of loyalty and love. Emily, too, felt her life change in ways she hadn't anticipated. Caring for Shadow had taught her about resilience, trust, and the healing power of connection. She started volunteering at a local shelter, sharing Shadow's story with adopters and helping other animals find their own happy endings. Years later, when Shadow passed away peacefully at Emily's side, the entire town came together to mourn and celebrate his life. They held a candlelight vigil at the memorial, sharing stories of how Shadow had touched their lives. Emily, though heartbroken, felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the time she had shared with him. "He taught me what it means to love without conditions," she said during the vigil. "And he showed all of us that even in the face of loss, love can carry us forward." Shadow was laid to rest beside Charlie's memorial, his name added to the marker with a new inscription. "Shadow, forever loyal, forever loved." Shadow's story continued to inspire long after his passing. Emily wrote a book about his journey, titled The Dog Who Waited, a story of love and devotion, which became a bestseller. The proceeds were donated to animal shelters across the country, ensuring that Shadow's legacy would help countless other animals find the care they deserved. For Emily, Shadow remained a part of her heart, his memory a constant reminder of the bond they had shared. She often visited the memorial, sitting on the bench and reflecting on the lessons he had taught her. On one such visit, as the sun set over the fields, Emily felt a gentle breeze brush her face. She closed her eyes, smiling as she whispered, "Thank you, Shadow, for everything." And in that quiet moment she felt his presence, warm, loyal, and unending, a reminder that love, once given, never truly fades. It simply finds new ways to endure. In the years following Shadow's passing, his story became a symbol of hope and love that resonated far beyond the small town where it all began. The memorial site, once a quiet stretch of forgotten road, transformed into a place of pilgrimage. People from all over traveled to pay their respects, leaving flowers, notes, and mementos at the base of the stone marker. The messages left behind were deeply personal, words of gratitude, stories of loss, and promises to honor Shadow's legacy. Some were written by people who had never met Shadow but felt connected to his story. Others came from those who had experienced loss and found solace in his unwavering loyalty. One message, written on a small piece of paper and tucked beneath a bouquet of daisies, read, "Thank you, Shadow, for showing us the strength of love. You helped me find hope again after I lost my husband. I'll never forget you." Emily often visited the memorial, finding peace in the outpouring of love it had inspired. She dedicated her life to sharing Shadow's story, traveling to schools, shelters, and community events to speak about the lessons he had taught her. One of her most cherished memories came during a visit to a children's hospital. She brought photographs of Shadow and read passages from her book, watching as the children's faces lit up with wonder. When she finished, a young boy with wide, curious eyes raised his hand. "Did Shadow ever stop waiting?" he asked. Emily smiled, her heart full. "Yes," she said softly. "He stopped waiting when he realized he was surrounded by love. And that's what he taught me, that love can heal us, even when we think we can't move forward." The boy nodded thoughtfully, hugging a stuffed dog he held in his arms. "I think Shadow was the bravest dog ever." Emily's eyes glistened with tears. "I think so too." The impact of Shadow's story continued to ripple outward. Inspired by his legacy, the town launched an annual event called Shadow's Day, dedicated to celebrating the bond between humans and animals. The event included adoption drives, fundraising for local shelters, and storytelling sessions where people shared their own tales of loyalty and love. On the first Shadow's Day, Emily was invited to cut the ribbon at the adoption fair. As she stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Shadow didn't just teach us about loyalty, she said, her voice steady. He showed us how to love without limits, how to honor those we've lost, and how to keep moving forward even when it feels impossible. Today we celebrate not just his life, but the lives he's touched, and the love he's left behind. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the town square. As Shadow's legacy grew, Emily found herself reflecting on her own journey. She often thought back to the stormy night when she had followed Shadow down the road, not knowing what she would find. That moment had changed everything, not just for Shadow but for her as well. It had taught her to listen, to trust her instincts, and to open her heart in ways she never had before. One evening, as she sat by the memorial, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a familiar sense of warmth. It was the same feeling she had often experienced when Shadow was by her side. A quiet, comforting presence that seemed to whisper, "You're not alone." Emily smiled, resting her hand on the stone marker. "You're still here, aren't you?" she whispered. "In every act of kindness, every wagging tail, every heart you've touched." Shadow's story continued to inspire long after Emily's time. Generations grew up hearing about the dog who had waited by the road, his loyalty unwavering, his love unending. The memorial became a lasting symbol, a place where people came not just to honor Shadow but to find hope and connection in their own lives. And though Shadow's physical presence had long since faded, his spirit remained, a quiet, guiding force that reminded the world of the power of love, the strength of loyalty, and the enduring bonds that tie us all together. Somewhere, in the gentle rustle of the wind and the warmth of the sun, his legacy lived on, a story without end, a love that never faded. The years passed, but Shadow's story never faded. It became a permanent part of the town's identity, told and retold with the reverence of a timeless legend. The road where Shadow had waited was officially renamed Shadow's Way, and the memorial site was expanded to include a small park. Families gathered there for picnics, adoption fairs, and quiet moments of reflection. One of the most striking features of the park was a bronze statue of Shadow, standing at the edge of the path where he had once watched the horizon. His stance was poised, his gaze calm yet determined, as if he were still waiting, not for an owner, but for every visitor to understand the lesson he had left behind. Beneath the statue, a new inscription was added. To Shadow, a testament to love that waits, hopes, and endures. Your story lives forever in every heart you've touched. For Emily, the park became a second home. Even as she grew older, she continued to visit regularly, sitting by Shadow's statue and greeting the people who came to honor him. She often brought her journal, jotting down reflections and stories she heard from visitors. One day, a young couple approached her with a small puppy in their arms. The woman smiled shyly as she said, "We just adopted her from the shelter down the road. Her name is Shadow, after him." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at the puppy's bright, eager eyes. "That's a beautiful name," she said softly. "He'd be proud." The couple sat with Emily, sharing how they had been inspired by Shadow's story to adopt and give the puppy a second chance. As they spoke, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. Shadow's legacy wasn't just a memory, it was alive in moments like this, carried forward by every act of love and kindness. As Shadow's story spread far beyond the town, it inspired movements across the world. Animal shelters and rescue organizations adopted his name, creating programs focused on finding homes for long-term strays and abandoned pets. His story became a rallying cry for compassion, reminding people everywhere that even the smallest gestures of love could have profound impacts. In schools, Shadow's tale was incorporated into curriculums, teaching children about loyalty, empathy, and the importance of caring for animals. Many students wrote essays or created artwork inspired by him, their imaginations painting vivid scenes of the dog who had waited so patiently on the empty road. One child, a girl named Mia, wrote a poem titled "The Dog Who Waited." Read. Through sun and storm he stayed, a love too strong to fade. Eyes fixed upon the endless road, his heart bore every heavy load. But in his wait a world did see, the depth of love unbound, set free. And now his story gently flows, through every heart his spirit knows. The poem won a national competition, and Mia was invited to read it at the annual Shadows Day celebration. Standing beside the statue, her voice steady and clear, she recited the words as the crowd listened in silence, many wiping away tears. As Emily approached the final chapter of her own life, she found herself reflecting often on the lessons Shadow had taught her. One evening, as she sat on the bench near his statue, she spoke aloud as though he were still sitting by her side. "You changed everything, you know," she said, her voice tinged with both gratitude and longing. Not just for me but for so many. Your love, it's still here. It always will be. The wind stirred gently, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. Emily closed her eyes, feeling a warmth that she couldn't quite explain. It was as though Shadow's spirit was there, wrapping her in a quiet embrace. When Emily passed, the town gathered to celebrate her life and the bond she had shared with Shadow. They added her name to the memorial plaque beneath the statue, ensuring that her role in Shadow's story would never be forgotten. The updated inscription read, "In memory of Shadow and Emily, partners in love, guardians of hope. Your legacy lives on." Generations later, the story of Shadow and Emily remained a source of inspiration. Families visiting the park would sit by the statue, telling their children about the dog who had waited and the woman who had given him a second chance. The road, the park, and the memorial became symbols of love's enduring power, a reminder that even in loss there could be hope. And somewhere in the quiet stillness of the world, Shadow's spirit lingered, a loyal presence, a guiding light, a love that never truly ended. Years turned into decades, and Shadow's legacy grew to become a global symbol of unwavering love and loyalty. The small memorial park by Shadow's Way evolved into a cherished destination for visitors from around the world. What had once been a quiet rural road now held a profound significance, a place where people came to reflect, to heal, and to honor the lessons Shadow had left behind. One day, a filmmaker named Rachel visited the park. She had heard about Shadow's story as a child and had always been captivated by the depth of his devotion. As she sat by the bronze statue, watching families and children gather near the memorial, an idea began to take shape. She decided to create a documentary about Shadow's journey, not just as a tribute to the dog himself but as an exploration of the profound bond between humans and animals. The documentary, titled The Dog Who Waited, premiered 2 years later to widespread acclaim. Combining archival footage, interviews with Emily before her passing, and reenactments of Shadow's journey, it captured the raw emotion of his story. Audiences were moved to tears by the scenes of Shadow waiting on the road, his unspoken grief reflected in his every movement. Critics praised the film's message of hope and resilience, and it sparked a renewed interest in animal welfare. Shelters reported an increase in adoptions, and donations poured in to support rescues and sanctuary programs. The documentary won numerous awards, but for Rachel, its greatest achievement was the countless letters and messages she received from people whose lives had been touched by Shadow's story. One letter, written by a woman named Sophia, stood out. "Watching Shadow's story reminded me of the love I shared with my childhood dog, Max. He waited for me every day after school just like Shadow waited by the road. Your film helped me realize that love like that never really fades. It stays with us, shaping who we are. Thank you for reminding me of that." In the town where it all began, Shadow's Day grew into an internationally recognized event. Each year, animal shelters, rescues, and advocates came together to celebrate the bond between humans and animals. The festivities included adoption drives, fundraising marathons, and storytelling sessions where people shared their own experiences of loyalty and love. One particular Shadow's Day became especially memorable when a group of children unveiled a new addition to the memorial park, a series of engraved stepping stones leading up to Shadow's statue. Each stone bore the name of a pet whose life had been inspired or saved because of Shadow's legacy. The children, many of whom had adopted animals from nearby shelters, had raised the funds themselves through bake sales and craft fairs. As the first visitors walked along the path, pausing to read the names etched into the stones, the park felt alive with the stories of those who had found love and connection through Shadow's example. Meanwhile, Emily's book, The Dog Who Waited, continued to inspire readers worldwide. Translated into dozens of languages, it became a cornerstone for discussions on loyalty, grief, and healing. Schools incorporated it into their curriculums, and families read it together, finding solace in its timeless message. One particularly touching story came from a teacher in Japan, who wrote to the town council to share how Shadow's story had impacted her students. "The children," she wrote, "have started leaving small gifts at our classroom's windowsill, imagining that Shadow might visit us someday. They say it's their way of thanking him for teaching them about love." As the decades stretched into centuries, the legacy of Shadow and Emily remained a guiding light. The park expanded further, becoming a sanctuary for both people and animals. Statues of Shadow were erected in cities across the globe, each one bearing an inscription inspired by his journey. In honor of Shadow, a love that waits, a love that endures. Technology advanced, but Shadow's story never lost its impact. Digital recreations of his journey were used in virtual reality programs to teach empathy and compassion. New generations continue to connect with the tale, finding hope in his unwavering loyalty. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon at Shadow's Way, the park was empty, save for a young woman sitting on the bench near the statue. She held a journal in her lap, writing by the fading light. "I never met you," she wrote, glancing up at Shadow's bronze figure. "But I feel like I know you. Your story reminds me of the love I've shared, the losses I've faced, and the strength I've found to keep going. Thank you for waiting, Shadow, for showing the world what love can be." As she closed her journal, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves around her, carrying a sense of peace that seemed to linger. Shadow's story wasn't just a memory, it was alive in every heart it had touched, a love that transcended time. And somewhere, in the quiet stillness of the universe, the spirit of a loyal dog who had waited by the road carried on, eternal, unbroken, and infinite. Generations passed, but the story of Shadow remained a cherished piece of history. Schools around the world taught children about the dog who had waited, using his story to instill values of empathy and perseverance. Parks and memorials dedicated to Shadow became sanctuaries for those seeking solace or inspiration, places where people came to reflect on the enduring power of love. In the small town where Shadow's journey began, Shadow's Way became more than a memorial, it became a symbol of the town's heart. Visitors from every corner of the globe walked the path that Shadow had once guarded so faithfully. The memorial park grew to include not just statues and benches but also a museum dedicated to Shadow and Emily's lives. The museum featured photographs, Emily's journal entries, and even a section where visitors could leave their own messages of hope and gratitude. One wall, titled Whispers of Love, was covered with letters and notes left by those who had been touched by Shadow's story. A recurring theme ran through many of the messages. People found strength in Shadow's loyalty and comfort in knowing that love could transcend even the greatest losses. The global reach of Shadow's story inspired technological innovation as well. A team of engineers developed an interactive virtual reality experience called Shadow's World, which allowed participants to walk alongside Shadow on his journey. The experience was designed not just as entertainment but as a tool for teaching empathy and understanding. Users could see the world through Shadow's eyes, feel his determination, and understand the depth of his loyalty. The virtual experience became a phenomenon, used in classrooms, counseling sessions, and even training programs for rescue organizations. People who experienced Shadow's World often described it as life-changing, saying it deepened their appreciation for the bonds between humans and animals. One participant, a young boy recovering from the loss of his family pet, wrote in a review, "Walking with Shadow made me feel like I wasn't alone. He reminded me that love doesn't go away, even when someone isn't there anymore." Meanwhile, the annual Shadows Day celebration continued to grow, evolving into a global event. Each year, millions of people participated, sharing stories of love and loyalty, adopting animals, and raising funds for shelters and rescue missions. The day became a unifying force, a reminder of the values Shadow had embodied. One particular Shadows Day was marked by a historic moment, the unveiling of a new initiative called Shadows Network. This global organization aimed to connect shelters, sanctuaries, and animal advocates, providing resources and support to ensure that every stray and abandoned animal could find a loving home. The initiative was a massive success, with thousands of shelters joining the network within its first year. Stories of rescued animals flooded in, each one a testament to Shadow's enduring influence. In the town that had been Shadow's home, a new generation of children grew up hearing his story. Among them was a boy named Lucas, whose family had recently moved to the area. Lucas was shy and struggled to make friends, often retreating to the park by himself after school. One day, as he sat by Shadow's statue, he noticed an older man placing a bouquet of flowers at the base. "Did you know him?" Lucas asked, his voice hesitant. The man smiled, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "Not personally," he said, "but his story changed my life." Lucas tilted his head, curious. "How?" The man sat down beside him, his gaze fixed on the statue. "When I was younger, I was going through a tough time. I felt lost, like I didn't matter. Then I heard about Shadow and how he waited no matter how hard it got. It made me realize that love and loyalty are the most powerful things we have. Shadow helped me find my way." Lucas nodded, his eyes wide. "Do you think he waited because he knew someone would tell his story?" The man chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe he just loved so deeply that he couldn't do anything else." As Lucas grew older, he carried Shadow's story with him, sharing it with anyone who would listen. Inspired by the dog's unwavering devotion, he pursued a career in animal welfare, eventually joining Shadow's network. His work saved countless animals, and every rescue felt like an homage to the dog who had waited by the road. On one quiet evening decades later, Lucas visited the park with his own children. They sat together by Shadow's statue, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the scene. "Did he ever stop waiting?" one of his children asked, their voice filled with wonder. Lucas smiled, his heart full. "He didn't need to," he said. "Because he found something bigger than waiting. He found a way to show the world how powerful love can be." Shadow's legacy stretched endlessly through time, touching lives, inspiring change, and reminding the world of the simple yet profound truth. Love, once given, never truly fades. It lingers in the hearts it touches, growing stronger with every story told, every act of kindness, and every life saved. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the universe, Shadow's spirit endured, a faithful presence, a guardian of love and loyalty, watching over a world he had changed forever. Years after Shadow's legacy had transformed lives across the globe, a storm began to brew, both literally and figuratively. The quiet park by Shadow's way faced a sudden and unexpected threat. A large development company had purchased surrounding land and announced plans to build a sprawling shopping center. The proposal included rerouting the historic road and potentially removing the park entirely. The news hit the town like a thunderclap. For many, the park wasn't just a green space, it was a sacred ground, a testament to love and loyalty. But for the developers, it was just another plot of land standing in the way of profit. Emily's book, The Dog Who Waited, had long since become a cultural touchstone, but even her words seemed insufficient to protect the park. The town council scheduled a hearing, giving the community one last chance to save it. The atmosphere was tense, emotions running high as the date drew closer. On the day of the hearing, the town hall overflowed with people. Locals, journalists, and even visitors from faraway places who had come to show their support. At the front of the room stood the developers' sleek representatives, their polished smiles belying their firm resolve. Opposite them, a group of townspeople clutched photos of Shadow, signs reading, "Save Our Park," and copies of Emily's book. Among the crowd was Lucas, now a leading advocate for animal welfare and a dedicated member of Shadow's network. He had flown back to his hometown as soon as he'd heard the news, determined to fight for the park that had inspired his life's work. As the hearing began, tensions mounted. The developers presented their case, citing economic benefits and job creation, their words smooth and calculated. But when the townspeople took the floor, their voices trembled with emotion. "This park isn't just land," an elderly woman said, her hands clutching the edge of the podium. "It's where we come to remember Shadow and what he stood for. It's a place of healing and hope. You can't just erase that." Others followed, sharing personal stories of how the park and Shadow's legacy had changed their lives. But as heartfelt as their testimonies were, the developers countered with cold, logical arguments, pointing to financial data and zoning laws. It seemed like an uphill battle, and hope began to waver. As the council prepared to deliberate, Lucas stood up, his heart pounding. The room quieted as he walked to the front, his presence commanding yet humble. He placed a copy of Emily's book on the podium and looked out at the crowd. "When Shadow waited by that road," Lucas began, his voice steady but impassioned, "he wasn't just waiting for his owner. He was teaching us something. He was showing us that love isn't measured by time or logic, it's measured by the depth of our devotion." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the council members. "This park isn't just about Shadow. It's about every story he's inspired, every life he's touched. It's about the values we teach our children and the legacy we leave behind. If we let this park be destroyed, we're not just losing land. We're losing a part of ourselves." The room erupted into applause, but Lucas wasn't finished. He held up a tablet, displaying hundreds of messages from around the world, letters, videos, and photos from people whose lives had been changed by Shadow's story. "This isn't just a local fight," Lucas said. "This is a global call to action. Shadow's legacy belongs to all of us, and we have a responsibility to protect it." The council members exchanged glances, visibly moved by Lucas's words. One of them, an older man who had grown up in the town, cleared his throat and spoke. "I remember when Shadow first appeared on that road," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I saw him every day on my way to work. I didn't understand then, but I do now. He wasn't just a dog, he was a symbol of everything we hold dear. And we can't afford to lose that." The developers tried to respond, but the tide had turned. The council voted unanimously to preserve the park, designating it as a protected historical site. The room erupted into cheers, tears streaming down the faces of those who had fought so hard. As the storm outside began to clear, Lucas walked to Shadow's statue, the crowd following behind him. He knelt beside it, his hand resting on the cold bronze. "We did it, Shadow," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We kept your story alive." The crowd began placing flowers and notes at the statue's base, a spontaneous act of gratitude and love. For Lucas, the moment was a culmination of everything Shadow had taught him. A reminder that love, loyalty, and perseverance could overcome even the greatest challenges. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the park in hues of gold and crimson, the crowd lingered around Shadow's statue. The victory felt monumental, not just for the town but for everyone whose lives had been touched by Shadow's story. It was a reminder that love and loyalty, even in the form of a lone dog waiting by the road, could inspire a movement capable of transcending time and place. Lucas stood beside the statue, his gaze fixed on the inscription that had become a beacon of hope for so many. As the last rays of sunlight bathed the words in a warm glow, he felt a profound sense of peace. The fight to preserve the park had been grueling, but it was worth every moment. Shadow's legacy was safe, and so was the message he had carried, that love in its purest form was eternal. The town wasted no time in celebrating. Over the following weeks, plans were made to enhance the park, ensuring it remained a place of reflection and connection for future generations. A new addition was unveiled, a pathway of stepping stones leading from the park entrance to Shadow's statue, each stone engraved with the names of those who had been inspired by his story. The first stone bore the name Emily, a tribute to the woman who had shared Shadow's journey with the world. On the day of the unveiling, families gathered from across the country, bringing their pets, children, and memories. Lucas stood at the center of it all, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of Shadow's impact. He watched as children laughed and played, as people shared stories of how Shadow had changed their lives, and as visitors quietly placed flowers and notes by the statue. One particular note caught Lucas's eye. It was written in a child's uneven handwriting and tied to a small bouquet of daisies. Read, "Dear Shadow, thank you for waiting. You taught me that love never ends. I hope I can be as brave as you someday." Lucas's throat tightened as he read the words, a lump forming in his chest. It was a reminder of why the fight had mattered, not just for the past but for the future. As the years passed, Shadow's Way became more than a local landmark. It became a pilgrimage for those seeking hope and healing. People from every corner of the world walked the path, touched the statue, and found comfort in Shadow's story. The park grew to include a sanctuary for stray animals, ensuring that every life like Shadow's had a chance to find love and purpose. Lucas, now older and reflecting on his own journey, often visited the park with his family. He would sit on the bench beside Shadow's statue, sharing the story with his children and grandchildren. Each time he felt the same sense of wonder, the same gratitude for a dog who had waited by the road and changed the world. On one such visit, as Lucas sat alone in the quiet of the evening, he felt a gentle breeze stir the air. The park was empty, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of life beyond the trees. He looked up at the statue, his heart full. "Thank you, Shadow," he said softly, his voice carried by the wind, "for showing us what love really means." For a moment, the world seemed to pause as though the universe itself was listening. And in that stillness, Lucas felt a warmth that could only be described as Shadow's presence, a quiet reassurance that his legacy would endure. Shadow's story became a timeless legend, told and retold for generations. It was a story of love, loyalty, and the strength to wait when waiting seemed impossible. And though Shadow was no longer there in body, his spirit remained, a faithful companion to all who sought comfort in his journey. Somewhere in the quiet corners of the universe, a dog who had once waited by the road now watched over a world transformed by his love. And in every heart he touched, his story continued to live on, eternal, unbroken, and infinite.